Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Lynn O'Hara, and I'm the Director of Programs for National History Day, and we are so excited to be here for our third year of the Ask the NEH Expert. This is an opportunity for our students who are working on NHD projects, whether they be for the school level or for the regional contests, to go ahead and learn a little bit from experts who actually work with the same kinds of skills your teachers are working on with you, but they actually do it in the real world. So we're really lucky to be joined by our friends at the NEH. You're going to meet Julia Wynn in just a minute. I want to say thank you to Adrian Wisnicki for joining us as our Ask the NEH Expert, as well as Wendy Rex Atzet. Wendy is our NHD coordinator in the state of Utah, and she's going to help us with some of our NHD questions that you have. Couple things for you to know tonight. First off, submitting questions. For Google Hangouts, there's not a question box like there is in a webinar, so we're going to use Twitter. Ask your questions, but use the hashtag NHD Hangouts. We're following those live. Our Director of Communications is live on Twitter as well, so he'll answer some, and we'll ask some of them live in this hour. Just make sure to use that hashtag and put the S on the end so that I can see your questions here. The other thing I want you to know is that if you have questions about technical how-tos with Weebly, so things like how do I upload a picture, how do I upload a video, how do I change my font, we have an archived webinar. On this webinar page, go ahead down to 2014 and the bottom right-hand corner, open that up. There's a Weebly how-to webinar that'll teach you all about how to do all those technical things. But tonight what we want to do is focus on some of the bigger picture questions and how to get yourself a really good website to move forward in the NHD 2016 contest program. So what I want to do at this point is turn things over to Julia Wynn from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Julia, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Lynn, and I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. Before we get started with our featured speaker, I just want to say a few words about NEH and what we do. So the National Endowment for the Humanities is a federal grant-making agency. We support research, education, and preservation in the humanities, of which, of course, history is a very important part. NEH supports a wide variety of activities. That includes the creation of books, documentary films, websites like the one that will be featured this evening, as well as programs for teachers and other things like that. We've supported National History Day pretty much from the beginning, and we continue that collaboration today. We support the NEH Scholar First Medals at the National Contest. We also have a special prize at the National Contest for the best use of Chronicling America in a National History Day project. Chronicling America is a partnership between the NEH and the Library of Congress that has digitized more than 10 million pages of historic American newspapers. It is a fantastic resource for National History Day projects because you've really got those primary source materials. It's all online, it's keyword searchable, you can zoom in, really, really great stuff. Our Edcitement team is also working very hard to support teachers and students. At Edcitement, you'll find over 500 lesson plans, over 400 vetted websites, student interactives, that sort of thing, as well as National History Day features and lessons on using Chronicling America. We also have, for the teachers out there, summer seminars and institutes and landmarks of American history and culture workshops, which are summer professional development programs. They bring teachers to residential programs that really expose them to important topics in the humanities. And the great thing is that they include stipends to help cover travel and living expenses for those programs. Our website, NEH.gov, has information about all of the things I just mentioned and a whole lot more, and you can really go in and explore some of the things that we funded over the past 50 years. But that's enough about NEH. It's now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Adrian Wisnicki, who is the director of Livingstone Online, which is a really, really fantastic website. So I'll turn it over to you, Adrian.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate the chance to speak with you and everyone else tonight. And as you know, I'm here to answer questions and more than happy to do so.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us. To get started, can you tell us very quickly for our students out there who David Livingstone was and what is Livingston Online, and how did you come up with this idea? What's the purpose behind the website that you're involved with?
Sure. So David Livingstone was a 19th century traveler from Scotland, and he's very famous for his travels in Africa. During the period that he traveled, say roughly 1840 to 1870, he was one of the most widely traveled Europeans in Africa, and often he was the first European to visit various parts of Africa, especially southern and central Africa. In addition to being a traveler, he was called an explorer in the 19th century. He was a missionary, he was a doctor, he was a scientist, and so he wore a variety of hats. Today, we really remember him most because at one point in his travels, Livingstone was stranded in Central Africa and was saved, you could say, really, by a fellow named Henry Morton Stanley, who greeted, when he finally encountered Livingstone, greeted him with the phrase "Dr. Livingstone," I presume. So that David Livingstone is the Dr. Livingstone that is referenced in that phrase. One of the reasons why Livingstone really matters to us today and to a kind of broader global community is that he was a very prolific writer. He kept all kinds of different records of his travels, from diaries and journals to letters, scientific notebooks, and maps, as well as illustrations. And in Livingstone's case, a lot of these manuscripts have survived, and often have survived actually in pretty good condition. The challenge of studying the manuscripts is that they're really scattered around the world. There's a large array of manuscripts in the UK, but there are also manuscripts in the United States, in South Africa, in other parts of Africa, in New Zealand, and there's kind of a long list of places where the manuscripts are. So for any given individual to look at these manuscripts, either individually or collectively, it can be a very difficult endeavor. So that's where Livingstone Online steps into the picture. Our goal is to collaborate with a variety of archives, libraries, museums, and other kinds of repositories around the world that have original Livingstone manuscripts, or that have some kind of holdings that are relevant to Livingstone, and to work with those archives and repositories and digitize their materials and then publish them through our site, Livingstone Online.
Well, let me start with a content question. If we have students out there who are looking at the story of Golden Africa, African colonization, or Livingstone himself, what are some ways that your website or a resource website like this might help them in the research process?
Sure. Well, that's a very good question. So our website really has a lot of different ways that it helps its audiences. One of the things that you'll notice is, if you visit the site, is that it's a very visual site. In developing the site, and especially kind of in developing the site recently, we've come to realize that we really live in a very visual culture, and people respond well to all kinds of images. And so one of the things that we've tried to do in the site is to really present all the different facets of Livingstone's career, as well as many ways that his legacy has been preserved visually from the 19th century to the present, and to include an array of images that bring out all those different facets in our website. So one way that the website supports that kind of research is through the visual dimension. Second way that the website supports research is that in addition to showing you Livingstone, it tells you a lot about Livingstone. So we have a variety of critical essays that bring out different facets of Livingstone's career, the times in which he lived, parts of Africa in which he traveled, some of the ways in which his legacy has been preserved over time, some of the ways that people have done that, different facets of Livingstone's scientific interests, his medical interests. So we have that. And then most importantly, and this is really kind of the star of our show, and it will be more so in 2016 when we complete the present phase of development, our site will provide access to about 10,000 original manuscript images. So you'll be able to go to the site and look at images of Livingstone manuscripts spanning some 30 years or even more of his life, covering every facet of everything he did in his travels, both in Africa and between Africa and Britain. So it'll really be a rich resource that brings people into first-hand contact with his original manuscripts. And there'll be images of the manuscripts so people can see how Livingstone actually wrote on the page, as well in a lot of cases, very detailed transcriptions, so that his words can be made even more accessible.
That's one thing some of our students struggle with, the handwriting on some of these documents, especially the older they are. So that'll be really helpful as that comes out. I know NHD students will be using this. But you
Sure.
mentioned the idea. Oh,
I
sorry, go
just
ahead.
want to mention too, one of the really nice things, and this has really helped with our project, is when you look at 19th century writing, it can often be difficult to decipher. Livingston's handwriting, on the whole, is not. He writes really well. He has a very good penmanship, and so that's been a boon to us because it actually is fairly easy to get used to his writing and to read it.
Nice. We can't say that about everybody who was writing in the 19th century, sadly, though, or even today for that matter. But you brought up something really interesting. You talked about that for building a website, that visuals are really important. That, we like to interact visually with websites, and they are different than, what we would write for a paper or for a journal article. So when you go to build a website like this or expand on it, what are some of the goals that you have as the website builder? Because what you're doing with your content is very similar to what our students are doing with their content, no matter what their topic is.
Sure. Well, that's a very good question. And one of the things that's happened with developing Livingston Online is we have really dedicated a lot of time to thinking about how modern audiences interact with websites, and also thinking about how Livingston's legacy has been represented over time, and what some of the kind of popular or reigning images of Livingston and of other travelers like Livingston, of other, what you could describe as explorers, are in popular culture around the world. And so the way we've developed the site is we're really responding to those kinds of representations. And we're responding in a very particular kind of way, in that historically, European travelers to Africa have been presented in very kind of isolated, iconic ways. They're shown as these kinds of figures that are disembodied from history. They're kind of striding across continents on their own, and so forth and so on. And nowadays, scholars really realize that that's not how history worked, and that's not how these travelers operated in their different historical moments. And so one of the things that we've been very keen to bring out in the kind of images we've used on our site is to put Livingston back into the history in which he operated, and to show him really involved in that history and tied into it in different ways, and to get users and visitors to our site to think about how that history and the different kinds of populations, especially non-Western populations with whom Livingston interacted, how all those elements and people impacted what Livingston did and how they really enabled what he did. And I know we have a couple of slides here from the site available. We could take a look at slide number 1 just to give you a very quick example of that.
Would you like the cover slide or the next slide?
The cover slide, the Livingston Online homepage slide.
Okay, we've got it up. Go ahead.
Okay, so normally when you go to an author-centered website, and I've seen this in a lot of different websites, whether they're explorers or other kinds of historical figures, what you expect to find on the homepage is a very distinct picture of the author, right? And so really kind of our project, as I just described it, really begins with our homepage, because what you get here on the homepage is Livingston in context. And in this particular case, Livingston is in a boat. To his right is Henry Morton Stanley, who was posing as American at the time. To his left is what looks like an Indian attendant, and then farther to Livingston's right are a number of African attendants. And so, even with this kind of image where it takes a moment to kind of figure out who Livingston is, and he's the one that's slightly stooping below the title, rather than kind of standing above everything, it shows him in a kind of international collaborative context in which he isn't normally represented. And even this image kind of really goes to the heart of what we're trying to do with the project as a whole.
I think it's really interesting that you talk about context, because that's so important in a good NHD website, that you don't just jump into the story, but that you understand kind of where your person or event fits in the overall structure. So I think that's a really good tip for our students here. But one of the things that our students struggle with sometimes is that they're very good storytellers. NHD kids can tell a story better than anyone. But we have to understand the idea of making an argument, so having a thesis and drawing it out. Can you talk a little bit about making arguments and some tips for our students, especially as they do so while building a website?
Sure. Well, one of the nice things about websites, which is very different from writing a traditional, let's say, 5-paragraph essay, is that websites, really the kind of possibilities for making an argument are endless, and they're really can be as creative as you want them to be, or you can come up with as many different solutions as you like. And in some ways, websites have a kind of complexity where you can develop different facets or aspects of the website, and they all go together to kind of create the cumulative website. So in our particular case, we have a kind of overarching idea, which I just outlined about putting Livingstone back into his historical context. Through the website, we can tackle that in different kinds of ways. So, I just gave you one example of Livingstone, what we did on our homepage. If you take a look at slide number 3, if you wouldn't mind putting that up.
Go ahead, we've got it up.
Okay, excellent. So this is another way that we've kind of tried to make an argument that Livingstone was collaborative, and also, so I should say, as part of this kind of idea of Livingstone working in collaboration, we've also tried to emphasize how Livingstone's legacy over time has depended on collaboration. And this is another page of our website here. And you can see here we've really used a series of 6 images to make a particular argument. Or a set of particular arguments. And so one is we want to argue that Livingstone was capturing different kinds of information. So we've given you some mathematical equations. We've given you a drawing of a tsetse fly, which is an important insect in his travels. We've given you one of his maps. At the top center there, you can see an illustration of the famous Dr. Livingstone, I presume, moment where Henry Morgan's family meets Livingstone. But then we've also shown you a few people from our project and shown you how they're collaborating to preserve Livingstone's legacy. Well, you can obviously tell I'm one of those people, but these are some of our other collaborators. There's a fellow from South Africa, and then 2 people from Glasgow, from Scotland. So another argument that we're making here is that Livingstone matters to an international audience, that an international audience is interested in his legacy, that his legacy has diverse functions. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that there are different kinds of creative ways to make different facets of your argument, and cumulatively within the website, those different parts come out as people explore the website. So everything doesn't necessarily have to be put in one place, or even put necessarily in a written fashion like you would in an essay. There are different kinds of ways to weave your argument into the particular site.
Excellent. Now, you mentioned collaboration. NHD students have the choice when they build a website. They can either build it independently or they can build in a group of 2 to 5 students. What are some of the challenges with building a website collaboratively, and what are some of the ways that you solve some of the challenges of collaboration?
Sure. So that's a really good question. So I guess building a website is obviously a very complex endeavor, and there are different facets to developing the website that can be more or less difficult, and in terms of implementing inside the website. And different people can have different ideas about how the website can be developed. They can bring different skill sets to the table. And so one of the challenges is really figuring out who will be doing what, and thinking about developing something like a website in such a way that each person that's involved is really working in the way that's best for them, and that really kind of engages and brings out their best, while at the same time having them contribute to the project and kind of contribute to the greater whole. And so a challenge is really kind of making that work on an ongoing basis. And so, for me, one of the roles that I play in this project is that's exactly what I do. As the director of the project, I work with people coming from very different fields, often with very different skills or different kinds of expertise, and I try to, in collaboration with them and in collaboration with different sets of them, work out ways that everybody can optimally contribute to the project. So I think that's the kind of biggest challenge, is not only kind of taking advantage of people's skills, but taking advantage of those skills in such a way that people themselves are engaged to actively contribute. Could you repeat the second half of your question for me again?
Well, just what are some of the ways that you deal with challenges? So, for example, if you have one idea for one of the pages of your website and then your other collaborator has a totally different idea of how it should go, what are some of the ways that you deal with that challenge? Because our students sometimes find themselves in the same position.
Sure. Well, so I mean, I have a particular answer for me. I don't know if this would always work for students, but I realized long ago that people will often have better ideas than me. So I tend to listen to their ideas very carefully because they'll often have the right idea, whereas I don't. Or if that's not the case, even if I feel like I have the right idea, I can learn a lot from what might not look like the optimal idea by considering their position. And so in my case, and I mean, I think this has kind of been one of the things that's really helped with the development of Livingstone Online. I'm very open to kind of taking in ideas from my collaborators. In fact, our project thrives on that. And I think that kind of openness, that kind of willingness to say, you might be right and I might not be right, often leads to a much better project. Because ultimately, even if somebody has, some kind of great idea, the project remains collaborative, and there's always a dimension where at the end of the day, everything is done as a whole. And the idea is that the sum of the parts of the project, of the individuals working on the project, is greater than any kind of, the separate individuals. So in our particular case, I mean, it's really deferring to other people's ideas and coming into discussions of different facets of development with the idea that they actually might have the better idea. And let's hear what they have to say.
That's a good thing for our students to remember, to make sure you listen first before you just say no or I want it to be my way. Because a lot of times that does make the best projects.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's talk about planning a little bit, because a lot of times many of our students are at this point of the year where they've done their research, they know an awful lot about the topic, and they're sitting down to plan the website, and they're not really sure how to do it. Can you give some tips for how you plan before you create?
Sure. So the most important thing that I would say is to break it down, right? Anytime you have a big idea, you need to think about, and when you're planning something like planning something like website development, think about what are the constituent parts of that, and to start with the big idea and then kind of lay down the parts and then start breaking down the parts and thinking about how much can you break down any given part. So it might be really difficult to think about creating a website, but it might not be that difficult to think about one of those parts. And once you've got a bigger overall plan, then you engage with one of the smaller parts and work on that first.
So building it page by page and not getting overwhelmed. I think that's a really good piece of advice.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have an idea of the big picture, and you should definitely start with the big picture, but you want to get down to the level where what you're planning can be doable or changeable in a very easy way. And it doesn't necessarily have to have tons of impact on everything else.
Here's another question. Similar to your site, NHD students build websites where they include different kinds of documents. So they might have photographs, they might have art, they might have a newspaper article or a video clip. And when you use media of any form or documents of any type, how do you use it responsibly? What are some of the tips you can give students?
Sure. So that's a really good question. And so, I should just step back a little bit and say one of the things that Livingstone Online does, and I've mentioned this already to a degree, is we work with a lot of individuals, but we also work with a lot of archives. Livingstone manuscripts are scattered all around the world. And in our particular case, I think we have about 40 different archives or libraries or museums that we've participated with at this time. And in most cases, given a project of that scale, most people are helping us either in kind of only partially paid way or in a pro bono way, or really just kind of out of the goodness of their own heart. And they're making really big contributions, and collectively, the contributions make our website really successful in what it's trying to do, but it really depends on all those individual contributions. And so one of the things that we try to do on the site is to really foreground the contributions of the different people by giving them credit in various ways. And people in archives. So, for example, when we have manuscripts or any kind of image of a manuscript or some kind of historical illustration or contemporary illustration, you'll see that below the image we always have some kind of credit line where we not only cite who created the image and some kind of date, but we also provide the rights under which that image is made available. As a publicly funded project, we're very interested in making our all the data in our site as publicly accessible and usable as possible. So we do try to get as much of our materials under a Creative Commons license, which allows reuse in educational contexts. But whatever the case is, we always provide credit there with the image. And then in various other places in the site, we'll have pages where we either cite all our collaborating institutions and discuss kind of on a broad level, on a higher level, all the kinds of permissions they've given us. Or in our particular case, we also have narratives that describe the kind of work we do and that cite the kinds of contributions that people have made. And those contributions are cited through the narratives themselves, through illustrations, and by presenting various kinds of documents that people produce in the course of the work. So one way to think of this is any opportunity we have, we try to cite contributions, whether they're contributions in the form of historical images or documents, or whether they're contributions in the form of people doing work for us or sharing ideas or something along those lines.
Absolutely, and the same holds true for NHD students. We talk a lot about credit and captions. So make sure you tell us this is a map of this place in this year. And students, that doesn't count towards your word count as long as all you're given is just the facts. But then given the credit line, so you're giving this is courtesy of this archive, or you're letting people know what library or historical society helped you get this image or this map that you're showing, and that's giving proper credit. And that's where we don't need full-blown citations. That's where your annotated bibliographies come in, students. So if I want to see that map, then I could go there and get the full URL and know where to go and find it, or know what place to visit to see it. Let's talk one more question about these images. When you use an image or a map, how do you help provide context? Because sometimes what we see is you'll see a website and student has their topic and they fill the page with maybe 25 images and they all go with the topic, but there's not a lot of context or understanding. What are some tips you can give students to help us understand the images or the documents they use?
Sure. Well, I guess two of the main ways that we do that. One is fairly simple. Is with the caption. So we might have the title of the image, the creator, the date, and some information about the copyright or the terms under which the image is used. But then we could also add 2 or 3 sentences right below the image that explain what the image is. So that's one really easy way. A second way is just to reference the image in the text. And not only refer to the image, but explain why the image is there in the first place, and what you, as a person who's presenting the image to an audience, why you're using that image and what that image means in the context of what you're saying. As you might imagine, with somebody like Livingstone, who's traveling to Africa in the 19th century, and whose travels are being represented over time by a variety of different creators, not everything is palatable to us today. So some of the images that we see, I mean, they're painful to see. It's painful to know that that's part of our kind of collective global history. It's important for people to see those images and to realize that aspects of history happen the way they did. We're not trying to whitewash history or anything like that at all on the site. But at the same time, it's really important to provide some, in our particular case, to provide some kind of critical mediation that explains what's going on in this image, and that contextualizes the image historically, so that people realize it came out of a particular historical moment, was created by people in a particular historical moment, and that those people were motivated by particular ideas or they had particular kind of goals. Another way of thinking of this is that no image or kind of representation is a universal, right? It's always emerging out of a particular historical moment, and it's really important to remember that. And as somebody who's presenting the image online, it's really your responsibility in some ways to provide some kind of critical mediation of that image, to get people to think about what they're seeing, not just to kind of passively absorb that image. And so some amount of text in the prose surrounding an image often does that well. And it can, sometimes it can be accomplished in a few sentences. Sometimes you may want to speak longer about a particular image that has a especially rich or provocative content.
I like the idea of the image is there. It should have a purpose. It shouldn't just be there because it's another picture of the person. But then to explain it, and that a key thing you said, put it in historical context. Make sure it makes sense. If it's important enough to be there, it's important enough to be explained. Okay, yeah, one last question. I'm going to give you a break here.
So I just want to add really quickly. So one of the things that is important to emphasize is we actually spent a significant amount of time choosing almost every image for the site. So we did actually put quite a lot of thought into all the images you see. Really, almost nothing that you see on the site in terms of images is random. So that's just something to emphasize.
Well, and I think it's important too, because sometimes you choose not to use images, and that's okay too. That's part of the editing process. It's the same as getting rid of sentences in your text that don't really say anything.
Sure.
Okay, last question. I'm going to give you a break. We're going to shift things around a little bit. But I want to ask the question about revision. NHD students have the opportunity from their school contest to a regional to an affiliate contest all the way up to the national contest in June to revise their projects in between the stages of competition. Can you talk a little bit about how you revise your work and how your team works to start with a product that's good and then go ahead and make it better?
Sure. So one of the nice things about working collaboratively, in particular in our project, is that often other people that one is working with will see things that you yourself didn't see. And so when we develop anything for the site, we're very keen to have multiple levels of revision. And this is seen in something like, in the way we produce our transcriptions, for example, we'll have one person create a transcription of a document, and then the second person will go through that transcription and proof it, and so they're revising as they go through it. Then a third person might go through the transcription and read it from a different kind of perspective. There's different ways to look at our transcriptions and proof it in that way. And so ultimately, something like a transcription that we publish will actually have gone through multiple stages of revision to ensure it's as accurate as possible. If we're drafting an essay, we follow a very similar process. One of the things nowadays, kind of working on an essay, which wasn't true necessarily when I was younger in, say, middle or grade school, is we can put an essay into something like Google Docs and share that essay with a number of people, and there's no such thing as kind of an unrevised essay, because everybody that contributes to the essay will not only contribute their portion or segment or whatever, they'll also look at the other parts. And in our case, everybody is always kind of producing very productive revisions. And so ultimately, the kind of essay we produce will have gone through multiple revisions by multiple people, and ends up being a much stronger piece because of that. Because different people have seen it. They've seen it not only at different points, but they've also seen it with very different perspectives. And each perspective, and when I say perspectives, not only their personal perspectives, but also their professional perspectives. They're coming from different kinds of expertise. Each person has something to contribute, and ultimately that makes for a much stronger essay. So that works really well in our context. Even if you're a student at home, or in middle or grade school, and you're not working with as many people as we are, it never hurts to have somebody else look at your work and provide feedback, because they will just see things you never saw. Right? You might work on an essay, you might look at 100 times, and there's a huge mistake in the first sentence that you'll never notice. That's just a really obvious example, but there are all kinds of things that people can notice and often provide good feedback on.
Absolutely, and I think that's really important to hear, because revision is tough, and we all need revisers. I said every good writer has a good editor, and usually it's more than one good editors if we're all going to be honest.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to shift kind of to the second half of our program and take as many student questions as we can. I have some for those of you who pre-registered, but please get on Twitter, use the hashtag NHD Hangouts. This is your chance to ask any question that you want about website building. We'll answer as many of them as we can. I'm going to give Adrian a break to grab a drink here, and I'm going to ask a couple questions here to Wendy Rex-Atset. Wendy is our coordinator in Utah, and she's got a really cool program there, and hopefully some of my Utah students are watching tonight. But what I want to start with is asking the question, some of our students are still at the point where they're choosing. Do they build a website, or do they create a museum exhibit? And, Wendy, can you tell us what are some of the advantages if you build a website as opposed to choosing one of those other categories?
Sure. That is such a good question, and it's a really good thing to think about as you're getting started on your project. One of the great things about websites is that they really provide you an opportunity to use a lot of different kinds of images in your project. Whereas, say, an exhibit, you're mostly going to use stills, photos, maps, pictures, that sort of thing. In a website, you can use stills, you can use photographs of historical documents, you can also use video clips and audio clips. So it gives you more flexibility in the types of primary sources that you can display. So depending on what your topic is, you might have a topic that has some great video primary sources, and a website would be a good way to integrate those into your presentation. Another thing that is really nice about websites is they make it easy for students who are working as a group to collaborate with each other, and you don't all have to be sitting in the same room. You don't all have to be at school together. You don't all have to be at somebody's house. You can each work on it from your own location. So that's really nice. A couple of other really nice things about the website category is that this is a great skill to have as you are advancing in school and thinking about future careers. Having some experience designing and building a website is a wonderful career skill. It's pretty fun, and it's something that's going to be relevant to you later, as you go through your academic and your professional career. One other really thing that can be helpful to various groups of people is that it's a fairly inexpensive kind of project to build. There aren't the kind of material costs that you'd have with an exhibit board or perhaps a performance. So that's something else to keep in mind.
Absolutely. NHD provides our Weebly for all our students. You have to use nhd.weebly.com to go ahead and get access, but that allows, I always said that Weebly levels the playing field in terms of websites. It's not about your technical ability so much as your thinking ability and what you can create. And Weebly's great in terms of letting you put things in and structure it the way you want. Okay, Wendy, I have a question for you. So as a coordinator, you see a lot of NHD projects at the regional level in Utah when you visit other states and when you're with us at the national contest every year. So what are some of the most common problems that you see from a judge's point of view? Or what are some of the things that your judges tell you that makes a website that might have good facts maybe not do so well? What are some tips for the students?
I would say in my mind, this is the problem. And also the great thing about the website category is that it really makes you think hard about organizing your material in a way that is logical, in a way that there is a good flow from one page to the next page to the next page. It's not the same thing as writing a paper because you have a lot more elements at play. And you need to make sure that your readers understand what you're saying and they can follow the thread through the website, that they don't get lost looking at one thing and can't find their way back to the home page. All of these kind of organizational skills are really an important part of making your website work well. And I think that's one of the great intellectual challenges of working in this category, is you really have to think that through.
I think that organizational structure and that logic is so important. A lot of times students will start off with storyboards, kind of like documentary students will be. And it's not a bad idea to see if you can take over your teacher's chalkboard one day after class, or even take some big pieces of poster board or butcher paper and start kind of scribbling out how does it work and how do we get from the first page to the second, and are there buttons or links to help connect us back? Okay, Adrian, I have a question for you. Many of our students ask questions about how to balance text versus images. Is there any kind of a rule of thumb about how much text you should have versus how many images? I know there's not a magic number. I know students want us to tell us that it's 2 paragraphs and 3 images, and then you're definitely going to win National History Day. But what are some tips that you can give them in terms of balancing the two?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's actually something that I've thought quite a bit about, as have my collaborators. And one feeling that we have is that a website definitely does not work like a paper, and so you really don't want to have a lot of text. You should also, continuous text. You should also think about how people read online, right? People tend to prefer shorter paragraphs that they can move through easily. They don't want really long paragraphs because that's not how we read online. So you can take very complex information, but you need to break it up. And then, online, you really have the option of mixing images with text and kind of doing that in a fairly regular way is not a bad idea. So some amount of text, some images. Usually you don't need a lot of images. One good image can work just as well as, say, 10 images or 2 images even. But so that's really kind of the rule of thumb approach that we use. We kind of try to balance. Another thing that one might do is to look at some existing websites that are well regarded and see what they do. Right. So, for example, especially for high school students, I might say, well, take a look at something like the New York Times. How does it alternate images and text? And see what you learn.
Absolutely. It's always good to look at other places to get ideas, because really they went through the same process you're doing, just on a different scale.
Right, and often they'll have people who are paid to really think about that. So people who are professionals, highly skilled designers. And so they've actually done some really good thinking, informed by a lot of research and so on. So there's no reason not to piggyback off them.
I think that's important for students to think about, because let's be honest, we've all gotten to a web page and you get to it and there's a whole lot of text in a really small font, and let's be honest, we kind of scan it for a couple seconds and then we tend to click away. And you don't want your NHD judge to want to click away from it. You want them to go, oh, this is really cool, let me keep going. Adrian, another question for you. As students are writing and kind of polishing, I have a lot of questions about how do I make my website really stand out? How do I make it look very professional? What are some things that you've seen as you look at websites that maybe make websites maybe less than professional? What are some things that maybe students should avoid or watch out for?
Sure. So one thing to think about is the internet is an evolving technology, and it's constantly changing and growing. And our expectations as users in coming to the internet are changing over time. And often now, if you look at a website that's even a few years old, it can look very dated, right? It can be done very well, and you kind of intuitively might know that it's professionally done, but because of its dated dimension, it looks less professional than, say, a website that's not done as well. And so one thing that's really important to know is just kind of being abreast of how websites are in the present day being designed. And again, going to examples of websites that you really like and looking at them and thinking about what makes this website successful on a professional level. And really trying to kind of, not just be a kind of passive user of the website, but really kind of be an active evaluator. So I think that's the best kind of advice that I would give, besides basic things like, make sure there's no mistakes, always triple and quadruple check your work before you show it to anybody, kind of, in terms of submissions or something like that. Even at my level, I teach college students, and one thing that I often do with students even just handing in papers is, when they're handing in a paper, I have them do a final reading of what is supposedly their final paper, and they still find mistakes. And so one way for students to, students in the middle school and high school level to avoid that is to proofread more times than they would think, and to even have other people look through it, and to get other people's opinions. Show them your website and say, does this look professional to you? We're all users of the internet, and whether we realize or not, we all have opinions on what makes a professional website. So the more outside perspectives you can get, the better. And it could be as simple as asking your parents or your brother or your sister.
Absolutely. Okay, Wendy, question for you. A lot of student questions I have about the word count issue. Can you explain exactly how this works in the NHD contest rules so that students know what they can do and what they can't do?
Yes, that is an important thing to figure out as you are starting. Don't wait until you're well underway to look at the rule book. So the first thing that you want to do is actually make sure that you have a copy of the rule book, the NHD rule book. You can download it for free from the website, or you might have a hard copy in your classroom, and go to the section on websites, because everything I'm going to tell you is also written there. The word limit for your website is 1,200 visible student-composed words. So that means that code that is not visible is not part of that word limit, okay? These are your words, the words you are using to express and to explain and to make your argument, present your historical context. They are the words that you are writing. So they do not include quotes, okay? They also, that word limit doesn't include like recurring titles or parts of the structure of your website that are going to show on every page. That's not part of that word limit. It also, the word limit does not include the credits that you're going to put by all of the images and quotes and documents that show on your website. You're going to give a brief credit right next to each one of those pieces, and that the words in that credit do not count against your student-composed words. Two more things that must go into your website that do not count against that word limit are your process paper and your annotated bibliography. Now, your process paper has its own word limit that is limited to 500 words. Your bibliography does not have a word limit. Okay, so that 1,200 student-composed visible words, that is the body of the text of your website. That are the words that are written by you.
Absolutely. I think that's really important. And sometimes students will ask me, well, are they really going to count the words? I can tell you, as you move up in the competition, they really do count the words. And we're at national finals. I'm telling you, they cut and paste and copy the words because I've seen our judges sit there with their computers and do it. So, you know, be fair. The idea of any limit, whether it's a word limit or a time limit on a performance, is that it's forcing you to edit. We can all write an awful lot. That doesn't mean it's well written. That part of NHD experience is writing and editing again. So those are really important skills. Okay, Wendy, you talked about crediting. So I have a couple questions. So if I put, let's say, an image in my website, and I credit it to the Library of Congress, and I say this is a picture of Alice Paul in 1918 or whatever it happens to be, do I then have to put that in my annotated bibliography?
Absolutely, you do. You have to put every single source in your annotated bibliography that's where you give the full citation. That's what allows a reader or another researcher who looks at your work and says, wow, this is great. I have got to get a copy of this picture. I need to look at this map myself. They can go to your annotated bibliography, and that extended citation will give them all the information they need to be able to find that source for themselves.
Is that the same if I use music or video?
Yes.
Doesn't everybody know what the song is?
You have to credit every source that you use in your website, in your project. Think of it as the equivalent for a historian of showing your work, right? This is how you tell all of the other historians, your teacher, the judges, the other people who are going to look at your project. This is how you are telling them, this is where I got my information. I stand behind this. And you can track it down yourself. It's how you show your work.
Sometimes we use the term digital citizenship for that, or historical responsibility. You can use whatever term you want. It's the same basic idea. If you didn't create it, you've got to give credit to the person who did. Because maybe one day you're going to be the person who has the book or the song or the video that other students are quoting. Kind of a creepy idea, huh? Okay, Adrian, question for you. Here's a student question that I got. A student asked, is it better to build a website with fewer pages that go on longer, or is it better to have a website with more pages that are shorter? Are there any kind of rules of thumb or ideas you can give those students?
Well, I would actually kind of fall between those two extremes. Long pages, you may just lose your readers, right? We're used to kind of going to a page, extracting the information, and getting out of there. So long pages can be a deterrent in that way. That said, I mean, there are pages that are very long and that are very interesting, and people will read them. And a really good example that comes to mind of a kind of page that we all use is a Wikipedia page, right? Often those pages can go on and on and on. The way the information is structured on those pages is different from kind of just pumping out a bunch of text. So that's a little different. That's something to consider. On the other hand, if the pages are too short, readers may just get frustrated from constantly having to click and go through different kinds of pages and so on. So I would actually kind of say the happy medium.
that's one of those good things that maybe you want to test out. You know, if you're not sure, have a couple people look at it, maybe your friends in class, maybe other teachers, maybe your librarian, and ask for honest feedback. Most of the time, people will do it, and as you said earlier, we're all internet consumers. We're all on pretty much every day, okay, every day, multiple times a day. Other question
Yeah,
for you.
just to follow up on that point, I mean, I think that's a really good point. One thing you can do once you've built a site is just have some people look at it and don't tell them anything. Just say, here's my site. I want you to look at it. I'm just going to watch you browse around my site and see what they do. And you may make some very interesting discoveries as to kind of the issues they encounter, the tendencies they have to go to particular things or avoid particular things. So it's a kind of silent observation of what somebody does with your site without any kind of guidance from you.
That's interesting. If they're always missing a button, maybe that's a good sign that you've got to make it bigger or more powerful or grab their attention. One other question for you, Adrian. A lot of students asked about how do you make decisions about things like color scheme, font size, font color. How do you create a scheme that goes with the content you're creating? Because we want to think about it. If your project's on, let's say, the Holocaust, probably picking hot pink and neon green is not your best bet. But how do you do that and make it kind of match and line up and make it easy to read?
Sure. So in my particular case, I mean, the answer is going to be a little funny, but I turned to one of my collaborators. I have a collaborator named Angela Aliff, who's actually watching tonight. She's a high school teacher, and she was one of the people that was really kind of responsible for helping us develop the aesthetic dimension. And I say, Angela, what do we do? So in that particular case, it's a really good example of when you have collaborators, they can bring a particular kind of skill to development of a site that you might not necessarily have. And something like choosing colors or choosing fonts, I discovered through the process of building the site, was not my forte. That said, there are various ways to go about this. And again, you know, I would really steer people to looking at other sites and seeing what kind of fonts and font combinations they use. Because often effective sites may use just a few fonts, but they use them in an interesting kind of combination. So you may have a serif plus a sans serif font, you know, one distinguishes from the other. There are various sites that can give you color schemes that will tell you which colors really go well together, and so you can turn to something like that. And some people may just kind of intuitively know those colors clash, they don't look well. Whereas, you know, for somebody like me, that's just never been my forte, but that's kind of one of the ways that I've worked around this, by working with people for whom it is a strength.
Absolutely. Using those people with those artistic talents. I'll be the first to admit that I'm a text person. That art piece and the design piece tends to elude me, but I know the people who I can go to and say, hey, tell me what you think. Do you like it? Do you not? Because I tend to be like, oh, it's all fine. But it's not when you really look at it, and you see that in other sites.
Sure,
Okay,
yeah.
Wendy.
So it's kind of a combination of kind of knowing who to turn to, but also knowing your limits and knowing that in some cases it's better to kind of look elsewhere. You're not going to figure it out on your own necessarily. You need to kind of draw on other resources.
Definitely. Wendy, NHD theme, exploration, encounter, exchange, and history. A lot of times students will write a really good narrative and build a good website, and the thing that their judges are pulling off for is they're saying, hey, you're not really connecting to the theme. What are some suggestions you can give students to really drive home that theme and raise that part of their score?
There are a couple of very simple, this is going to seem simple when I say it, but you need to explain how your project relates to the theme. And you need to explain it in a really direct and clear way so that you say, the subject of my website explored Africa in these many ways. And then you can go on and make another very explicit connection to encounter and to exchange if you were working on Livingstone. And then you don't just want to say that one time in one place. You want to show, as you go through narrating the story that you're telling, you want to call out for us, here's an example of exchange. Here's an example of cultural encounter. And so that it's clear to us that you understand all the many different ways your topic relates to this year's theme. So you want to say it at least one time all together, and then in a very clear and labeled place on your website, and then you want to point it out as you go through your narrative every place that it's relevant to what you're explaining to us. So one thing I like to make, there's a difference between picking a topic that seems like it's so obvious about exploration that I don't really need to talk about exploration in my project because it's clear that this person was an explorer. That isn't enough. You need to explain it and be very clear about how you see all the many different ways you see exploration or encounter or exchange appearing in this story that you're telling.
Absolutely, that idea of be explicit and hit it over the head. Remember, judges don't know what you think, especially with websites, because remember, they're evaluating them a week, 2 weeks, sometimes a month before you ever come in for your review. And it's really important that you're explicit because they don't know what you know and they haven't read everything you've read, and you want to just really be explicit and hit that nail over the head and make it really, really clear so they know, wow, this student knows it. It's not just we think they know it, we know they know it. And I have time for one last question. So, Wendy, I have a teacher question here. One of our teacher viewers asked, do you have any tips for a first-time NHD teacher working with website students this year?
I do, and I'll tell you, I'm so glad you sent this question in ahead of time because I called up a friend of mine who's been teaching websites to his kids for quite a while, and I said, what can we tell these new teachers? Here's our advice. First, make sure that the students begin at the NHD Weebly portal. They cannot build it in regular Weebly. So you have to start in the right place. Then make sure that you're there with them to walk through that first registration process as they set up their account with Weebly. Then make sure that you keep a list of all of your students' Weebly usernames and passwords, and keep it for the whole rest of the contest season. Because as they progress through the process, they're going to be going in and out of that website, and they may leave it for a few weeks, and when they come back to work on it again, they will need that username and password to get into it, and they will have very likely forgotten where they wrote it down, and so you will have that on a list, and you'll save everybody a lot of heartache.
Excellent. Well, I know we're pushing on our time here, so I just want to take a moment and thank all our guests tonight. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Adrian. And turn things kind of back over to Julia. I will mention one thing before I pass it over. If you are watching live, so students, if you want to let your teacher know you are watching this live, or teachers, if you want to let your principal know that you put in an hour tonight, right underneath where you see this on the NHD webpage, there is a survey link. It'll take you less than a minute. We appreciate giving us some feedback on our program. In addition to that, it will allow you the option if you'd like to receive a digital badge. That's an email that will come to you tomorrow. That's your proof of essentially attending the live program. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Julia Wynn. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Lynn, and I want to thank Adrian and all of our participants this evening. Thank you, everyone who was watching the Hangout. We really had some great questions. I hope that this has been a helpful way to think about getting started on your website and thinking about ways that you can create a really strong website for your NHD project. And finally, I would just remind you that NEH offers a variety of resources, starting with Chronicling America and Incitement, but a whole host of other resources. So check out NEH.gov to see some of the things that we have that might help you with your projects. And also don't forget about your state humanities councils. Every state has one, and a lot of them are actively involved in National History Day. So don't forget to reach out to them as well. Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. And we will be back on Tuesday, December 15th with our paper writers. Have a great night and good luck in NHD 2016.